The mortal sin of science. One could make a parallel between Moses and the fantasies of the Bible, and Einstein and his theories, and how both, equipped with a similar megaphone, had misled the human minds for centuries. But this will not be the place for such argument. Still today, modern science continues to want to justify at all costs some absurdities from Einstein, like the theory of relativity, even at the expense of the good common sense. For example, the twin paradox in the theory of relativity. How is it possible to think that an individual could make a journey through time and come back to Earth younger than he was when he first started to travel? It would not make sense. And yet, it is part of science. It is not a matter of complicated formulas to understand. Instead, it's a matter of removing at the roots those assumptions, adopted and never tested by science, that gave life to those same formulas, and wanting to prove such absurdities. In general, science admits into its realm only an event that may be repeatable and observable. But for Einstein, it was made an exception. Often, the rigor of science reaches the far opposite, affirming that when one electron, or one photon of light is not observed, it does not have any position in space. And its position becomes materialized only as a consequence of one human observation. Inexplicably, even this paradigm continues to be part of modern science. One can infer from this that the human observation then becomes not only creator of an event, but also adds up to a fourth dimension, besides the only three true concepts: time, space, and movement, which is energy. What is most important is that the limits of our senses lead to a distortion of the relation between time and space. Thus, the concept of simultaneity. All began in 1927, in Copenhagen, when the scientist Heisenberg introduced the uncertainty principle. And according to this, it is not possible to exactly determine at the same time the space and movement of a particle. The problem is that to obtain an exact position occupied in space, for example, by an electron, it takes the use of short wavelengths, which transfer to the electron a great amount of energy, turning that electron unpredictable and uncontrollable. Instead, to obtain a precise account of the movement of the electron, it takes a very small amount of light, very long wave, which results in a poor definition of the position in space of that particle. The more exact and defined is the space of a particle, the more difficult is to know its movement, and vice versa. Heisenberg manifested his frustration in the inability to determine the exact position of an electron. And with his uncertainty principle, it was then decided that what could not be observed with human eye will not be part of science. In reality, the fact that we cannot yet observe the exact space and movement of one electron should not imply that the electron does not occupy one position in space at any given moment in time. It is evident that our knowledge occurs through the perception of our senses. But it should be equally evident that one world exists, and it is independent from our senses. Another misleading theory regards the so-called curved space. In the theory of relativity, a stone that falls on the ground from the window of a moving train, according to Einstein, also marks one parabola in space. The intent is to show how the position of the pebble changes, defining a curvature because of external forces like the moment of inertia and the force of gravity. The misstep is here precisely in this assumption. These forces necessarily imply also a time during which they can act. Thus, the simultaneity of the instant is bypassed. And as a consequence, the definition of that original space is altered. What space was the scientist exactly referring to? If the scientist had considered that the coordinates of space and time are unique and unrepeatable, then all of the rest would have also been straight. That perpendicular is straight, but accounted as curve, because of the limits imposed to science that make it impossible to recognize the concept of simultaneity. In reference to each body, at any moment in time, there are always only 2 points in space, for one perpendicular. If time and movement were accounted for in simultaneity, and with only 2 coordinated points, there is no curve. Any one perpendicular is unrepeatable, and never the same. Because while the measure of it is repeatable, and any measurement can be applied for different segments, instead, one perpendicular marked in time will never again have that same spatial positioning. The perpendicular changes in time. But Einstein believed that the concept of space is independent from the concept of time. As mentioned before, another victim of a special theory of relativity is the concept of simultaneity, which ends up losing its absolute meaning. This is in regard to Einstein's example of 2 beams of light hitting one same embankment of a railroad on 2 points, point A and point B. In between the two, there is also the middle point, point M. If one train were to run over that track, then on the train, we would also have point A1, on the wagon of the train, right above point A, and one corresponding point B1, right above point B. We would also have on the train, point M1, above point M. Einstein's theory is that as for point M, not moving because on the embankment, those 2 beams are simultaneous and equidistant. Instead, for the passenger sitting on point M1, and moving towards point B1, and also point B, the 2 beams are not simultaneous. Because the point B1 is being approached by the moving train, therefore closer to point M1. In this example, while Einstein's concept of time is rigidly kept unchanged in regard to the embankment, instead, the concept of space is extended also to the next moment in time, when the traveler will move, even if in that precise instant, the traveler has not moved yet. Since the concept of simultaneity had been put aside, Einstein considered time to be the same, while space instead had changed. Also, this same scientist erroneously believed that all colors in the light spectrum travel at the same speed. Much confusion comes from these approximations. One new awareness will be found in between the winding creativity of the human mind and the rigid logic of numbers.